Anyone familiar with the Calloway family would have told you that the story was always destined to go one way. The heir and golden son, Damien Calloway, was to inherit the family business. I was only the fallback option. Unless they needed me, they kept that one hidden away in the shadows. My father always seemed to assume that daughters were meant to be servants, to patch up breaches and keep everything together in silence. I tried to disprove him for most of my life. In our home as children, Calloway and Sons Manufacturing was the nearest thing to a god. It provided us with food, clothing, and a roof. Henry Calloway, my father, made sure we never forgot it. During dinner, the topics of quarterly reports and profit margins were discussed. Every choice, including family vacations and holidays, was evaluated in light of the business's financial performance. In our household, you had to earn love. What about Damien? It was something he had earned since birth. By the time I was 15, I had given up. Through internships, academic grants, and late nights spent studying balance sheets under the light of a desk lamp, I forged my own route. While Damien fumbled through business school on his father's pay, I established myself in the banking industry. I didn't hold off until someone noticed. I simply continued to move. On a chilly December morning, the call came in. My dad didn't inquire about my well-being. He didn't. His voice clipped. "Daisy, we need to talk." The dining table was already arranged like a negotiation room when I arrived at their place that evening, with papers all over it and numbers leaking from each page. There was Damien, avoiding eye contact and swirling whiskey in his glass, with her hands folded in her lap as if she had no right to touch anything unless requested. My mother sat calmly next to him. Even before anyone spoke, I understood what this was. The business was losing money. I was supposed to fix it for them. I ought to have left that evening. I ought to have let everything burn. However, I still harbored the hope that I would one day make a difference, and that my father would notice me because I had preserved his heritage. So I stayed. I put my signature on the documents. I called. I made a pull. I spent 6 months using bloodied fingers to patch that company back together, reorganizing debt, persuading investors to stay, and balancing books that ought to have been left to decay. I gave my everything to preserve a legacy that was never intended to belong to me. The email arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. My dad's updated will. Every single dime, every portion, everything. Damien was left. Not one word about me. The only justification he offered when I barged into his study that evening was the same one I had heard all my life. "You'll be fine, Daisy. You always are." I never asked for his affection again after that night. The earth continued to revolve the day I severed my father's connection. Something huge should have changed. Like the entire world should have realized that the unseen daughter had finally ceased keeping things together. But instead, I half expected lightning to break the sky. However, nothing took place. The following morning, the sun continued to rise. Even so, I woke up by myself. The sole distinction was the removal of the weight that had been bearing down on my chest for 33 years. The silence seemed terrible at first. No more phone calls. Family business emails will no longer be tagged as urgent. I should have been relieved, but instead I just felt vacant. I continued to wait for him to call, continued to wait for a glimmer of sorrow to break through that calculating, icy voice. However, my father wasn't a pleading man. He was the type of man who waited, as I always did, for me to return in a hurry. 4 days later, the first email arrived. Subject, "Let's use common sense." I didn't open it. 2 days later, there was a second email. Subject, "You are not as big as this." That one I opened. Balance sheets, creditor reports, and debt projections were all numbers. Everything they couldn't solve without me, on a cold list. No mention of anything I had already provided. Not a single thank you. Heat rose under my skin as I gazed at the television. When Damien was sitting on his golden throne, he still considered me to be a tool, a small cog in the Calloway machine designed to keep everything going. I ended the email. I didn't respond. The visits began by the end of the week. Like some shabby peace sacrifice, he sent Damien first. One evening, I saw him sitting outside my office, leaning against the wall with that half-drunk, lazy smirk he had been honing since high school. He said, "Come on, Daisy," as though we were children once more. You're really going to let the company sink just to prove a point? I hardly gave him a glance. You should have learned how to swim, Damien. He made no more attempts. My mom gave me a call the following week. It was as if someone had grabbed inside my chest and squeezed when I heard her words. She made no requests for cash. She merely inquired about my well-being. I nearly broke. She still thought that this was something that could be fixed, that we could all get together for Sunday supper and make everything work again. She still had optimism where I couldn't, and I detested it. I declared my love for her. I hung up after that. My father arrived at my workplace by the third week. He didn't need to speak. Even before he opened his mouth, I could smell the desperation on his face. I gave him a half hour to wait in the lobby, just long enough to remind him whose time was now more important. He fixed his tie and made an effort to gather himself. When I eventually went outside to meet him, he said, "Daisy," as if this were a casual visit. "Good to see you." I folded my arms. "Is it?" For one moment, his smile wavered. Then he gave the speech for which I had been waiting my entire life. The legacy of the family. The workers rely on us. How self-centered I was, how I was ignoring those who most needed me. I paid attention to everything. As I waited for that recognizable pain to wrap inside my chest, I allowed him to pile guilt onto guilt. However, it never materialized. I leaned in close enough to see the perspiration trickling down his brow when he eventually ran out of things to say. "I've already saved the company once," I muttered. "And you repaid me by pretending I didn't exist." I believed his teeth could break because of how tightly his jaw was clenched. "This isn't about the will, Daisy." I gave a harsh, slow smile. "You're right. It's about who I am without you." He left that office feeling proud, head held high, shoulders set, as if his mere presence had gotten him a prize. But the truth was known to both of us. He had no one left, so he came to me. The smear effort began 2 days later. Whispers of anonymity crept into business pages. Callaway and Sons is threatened by family conflicts. A daughter leaving when they are in need. They never called me by name or explicitly stated that I was the bad guy. We all knew who they were referring to, though. During my morning coffee, I gazed at the headlines, anticipating the onset of panic. I'm waiting to feel small once more. Rather, I just felt exhausted. I didn't even bother to open the following email when it arrived. I didn't read a word before hitting delete. They sent my mother again when I refused to give in. One night, like a woman torn between two worlds, she appeared at my flat, wringing her hands in the corridor. "Daisy, he's not eating." My heart was exploding as I gazed at her. Maybe he's finally learning what it feels like to be hungry. In the same way that I had been saving everyone my entire life, I wanted to take her inside, cover her with a blanket, pour her a glass of wine, and save her. However, she refused to be saved. All she wanted was for me to return. That was the most difficult aspect of all, being aware that she would never leave, being aware that I never would. 3 weeks later, the last call was made. This time, it was Damien, and he sounded tight, as if he had practiced the entire speech. "Dad's in the hospital." As I waited for the guilt to clamp its icy fingers around my throat, I pressed the phone closer to my ear. However, nothing appeared. I wasn't cold. I simply could no longer bear his burden. "He's asking for you," Damien stated. He was, of course. Every time he needed something, he called for me. "I'm not coming." For a considerable amount of time, there was only the sound of Damien's breathing on the other end of the line. "You really hate him that much?" I shut my eyes. "No," I muttered. "I love him too much to let him use me again." I never heard my brother's voice again after that. 6 months later, the business failed, as I had always predicted. Despite surviving the heart attack, my father never recovered the things he had lost. Creditors picked Callaway and Sons clean, selling it in bits to men who didn't care about family traditions. The name vanished. The power did the same. Without a single remorse, I left. Ultimately, my father taught me nothing but how to burn bridges. He never realized that I had figured out how to use the ashes to create something better. I still occasionally think about him. I wonder whether he ever notices the empty dinner table or the chair where I used to sit and understands that I was the one keeping everything together the entire time. However, I no longer lose sleep over it. Certain debts are unrepayable. After the hospital call, the days passed slowly, yet I never felt the weight on my chest. I kept waiting for that familiar aching to swell beneath my ribs, the same ache that had always dragged me back, always forced me to make things right, to sink its claws into me. However, it never did. I believe that even before the heart attack, I had been grieving for my father. It's hardly possible to grieve someone completely at once. You gradually lose them until eventually there is nothing left to miss. I didn't approach. My mother would send brief, clipped updates every couple of days. Steady, sleeping. Physicians are optimistic. She never made a direct request for me to return home. This time, I believe she had finally realized that I wouldn't bend. It ought to have been liberating. Rather, it was like waiting for the final rope to break while standing at the edge of a vast, never-ending chasm. On a night when early spring had wounded the sky, my mother called once again. Daisy. The edges of her voice were worn thin, and she spoke softer this time. He's asking for you. He was, of course. Every time he had something to lose, he called for me. I allowed her words to sink into the voids within me as I closed my eyes. He wants to apologize. I nearly laughed at that. Not because I didn't think she was real. However, my father was the type of man who believed that saying sorry was a sign of goodwill. He believed he could use a few well-chosen phrases to purchase his way back into my life. He was still unable to comprehend I wasn't for sale. I'm not coming, Mom. Her breathing, unsteady and delicate on the other end, became so quiet that I could hear it. I don't know how to leave him, Daisy. My heart tightened. Because the reality she had hidden under decades of loyalty was there. I had always been trapped, and so was my mother, whispering, You don't have to leave him, but I can't stay. I was lying awake in bed that night, gazing up at the ceiling. Every instance of my life where I had lowered myself to fit into the gaps of their failed marriage, every time I had patched things up, every time I had allowed myself to think that by remaining, I was protecting her was replayed in my mind. I had carried my father's burden all my life, and now I was forced to leave her to bear his alone myself. The letter came 2 days later. I discovered it in my mailbox, thick, cream-colored paper with my name written in my father's angular, slanted handwriting across the front. I stood on the porch, looking down at it as if it were about to bite. I had never received a letter from him before. My dad loved numbers, contracts, and business transactions. Words were merely instruments to achieve his goals. After carrying it inside and placing it on the kitchen table, I turned to go. I brewed coffee. I washed the dishes. I did some laundry folding. I acted as though I could disregard it, as though it were just another bill or piece of paper with no real significance. But with unseen hands tugging at me, that package sat there, heavy as stone. I was unable to resist by midnight. With trembling fingers, I cracked the seal. Daisy, I finally managed to say something without you interrupting, if you're reading this. I am aware of your anger. You are perfectly entitled to be. However, your status as my daughter remains unaffected by your rage. Whether you choose to be or not, you are still a member of this family. The past is beyond my control. The decisions I've made cannot be reversed. Calloway and Sons, however, is larger than either of us. It transcends both pride and wounded sentiments. It requires you. Daisy, come home. If not for me. Afterward, for your mom. By the time I was done reading, my hands were trembling. Not because I thought he was real, but because he was still unable to see what he had done to me. Even at the end, he didn't desire my return. The fixer was what he desired. The safety net. The daughter who was invisible but always appeared when things were going wrong. I carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. In the sink, lighted on fire. Something inside of me unclenched by the time the paper turned to ash. It was a knot I had been holding for so long that I hadn't even noticed how tightly it had been twisted. He was free to maintain his excuses. He was able to preserve his legacy. He could retain all of the fragments of himself that he was still attempting to mend through manipulation and shame. He merely intended to burn the bridges I had finished building. A week went by. Next, 2. The updates ceased to arrive. No more emails, no more phone calls. I believed they finally got it. I had no plans to return home. Like the last breath of something that had been dying for years, the last cord snapped softly. I once woke up to the sound of rain hitting the windows at around 3 in the morning. After making myself some tea and padding barefoot into the kitchen, I stood at the sink and watched the storm come in. My father was still struggling to save everything he had created, somewhere out there. However, without me, it would fall apart. That makes me selfish, I thought. I knew better now. I didn't become selfish as a result. I was set free by it. I had blocked every number, erased every email, and closed every door they had ever attempted to keep me behind by the time the sun dawned. There was no forwarding address left by me. That was not what I owed them. My final communication was brief and to the point. I will no longer carry this. I still occasionally think about him. I wonder whether he ever sits at the head of the dining table and realizes he's the only one left, or if he ever wakes up in that large empty house. I wonder if he ever sees the fragments of his own legacy and comes to terms with them. The only thing keeping it together was me. However, I no longer have to bear that load. That year, spring arrived slowly and cautiously, as if the ground were holding its breath. I had already forgotten how to miss them by the time the first blossoms appeared on the branches outside my window. I never returned. Not when the business failed. Not when Damien's irate text became acrid silence. Not when the gossip pages began speculating that Callaway and Sons was failing due to poor management, as though I had never owned that business. When my mother called to inform me that he was gone, I didn't even pick up. She murmured softly. He passed in his sleep, her voice barely audible over the static. He didn't suffer. I put the phone to my ear, waiting for a final wave of grief to wash over me, for something to burst inside of me. However, nothing was present. Nothing but quiet. She didn't inquire about my attendance at the funeral. She probably knew the answer by then. He was described as a visionary businessman in the obituary, a guy of the family, a cornerstone of the neighborhood, everything that the world was meant to remember him for. Callaway and Sons was referred to as a legacy. However, the truth was only known to me. A house of cards was what it had always been. Ultimately, he left Damien in charge of everything. He never altered the will despite everything, even the hospitalization, the letters, and the pleading. I didn't cry upon hearing it. I simply grinned slowly and bitterly, allowing the last vestige of hope to linger within me. After the funeral, my mother gave me one final call. Silently, "They're selling the house," she said. In my mind, I saw Mom standing by herself in those empty rooms, polishing silver that would never be used again, and cleaning the large mahogany table where I had previously sat with my tiny hands clasped in an attempt to get attention. "Come with me," I said without a word. On the other end of the telephone, her breath caught. I had a fleeting hope that she might say yes. Then she let out a steady, slow breath. "I don't know how to leave." I pressed my forehead against the window glass and closed my eyes. I know. She didn't call again. The Callaway name was sold off in bits to the highest bidder by the summer, and it completely vanished from the city. First came the house. The business did the same. Everything he had created was destroyed in 6 months by the same hunger he had fought his entire life to avoid. I believed that would be sufficient to liberate me. No, it wasn't, because freedom is a process that takes time to achieve. Slowly, one little deed at a time. The first time you let a phone ring without picking it up, it happens. It occurs when you discover you haven't checked your email in 3 days after waking up. It occurs when you give up waiting for someone to find you, and instead, begin searching for yourself. I purchased a small home by the water. There were only 2 bedrooms and a salty-smelling porch. With my own hands, I turned the soil one fistful at a time to grow a garden in the backyard. When autumn arrived, golden and obstinate wildflowers had begun to scuttle through the crevices and bloom in the ruins. One weekend, Mara stopped by, barefoot and with a bottle of wine. She whispered, "You really did it," as she stood on the porch, her curls tangled in the wind. Looking out, I saw the waves smashing against the beach. Did what? Her grin was gentle and perceptive. "You became your own name." 6 months later, Damien sent his final email. "I hope all is well with you. Everything was damaged by you." I kept staring at it, waiting for the pain, waiting for the guilt. However, I felt nothing. I typed up one response. Nothing was ruined by me. I simply quit trying to keep my composure. I blocked his number after that. They continued to live in the debris. I was creating something fresh. The reality is, Some families are destined to disintegrate. Not all bloodlines are intended to be perpetuated. I used to believe that leaving was a sign of selfishness. I realize now that it set me free. I once stood barefoot in the garden with my hands buried deep in the ground, long after the sun had set. The silvery, watchful moon hung low overhead. I felt the cool, moist ground between my fingertips as I closed my eyes and breathed in the salty air. The waves continued to crash in the distance, constant and unending. Whispering into the darkness, I put my palms into the soil. I forgive you, not for him, for me. The garden was in full flower by spring, tangled and wild. Things that are broken can only be beautiful. I didn't talk to my mom ever again. Damien's voice was never heard by me. I never returned. Not all debts are intended to be repaid. It's best to bury some bloodlines. He died, and so did the Calloway name. I was no longer his daughter. I was something else. He had never even bothered to think about it. I had freedom.